recommend you buy the RTX 5070, there's not much point making that comparison, at least not for our initial comparison. So while I may very well add the RTX 5070 to this dataset in the future, I'm personally far more interested in the 5070 Ti versus 9070 XT matchup, and I'm sure many of you are as well. As a side note, we will continue to provide you with monthly GPU pricing updates, just like the one Tim made a few days ago now, so be sure to cross-reference this data with any future pricing updates. Now, for this test, I have covered 55 games at 1440p and 4K, which is why you haven't seen much content from me over the past week. I've been busy putting together this mammoth benchmark, and I'll go over the individual game data for around 20 titles, and then we'll take a look at how these two GPUs compare across all 55 games in a single graph. So let's get into it. We're starting with the bad for the Radeon GPU. The new Grand Theft Auto 5 enhanced version doesn't play nearly as well in the 9070 XT as it does the 5070 Ti, and as a result it's 29% slower at 1440p and then 24% slower at 4K. So not ideal, but hopefully AMD can improve performance here with a future driver update. We're also seeing that performance in ACC is very weak. It's certainly playable on the Radeon GPU, but weak relative to the 5070 Ti, as it was 35% slower at 1440p and 37% slower at 4K. Again, the hope is AMD can improve performance here with a driver update. Now, the 9070 XT was a little more competitive in Counter-Strike 2, coming in 10% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, and then 13% slower at 4K. The Rocket League results, though, they're quite unexpected. Somehow, the 9070 XT is 41% faster than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, and 36% faster at 4K. This clearly has to be a GeForce driver issue, but it's a bit odd given Rocket League is both a popular and very well established title, so you'd expect Nvidia to be on top of this one. Hunt Showdown 1896 was problematic for AMD, as the 9070 XT was considerably slower than the 5070 Ti, 35% slower at 1440p and 39% slower at 4K. So this is potentially yet another title with driver related issues. Marvel Rivals was extremely competitive, as here the 9070 XT was just 7% slower at 1440p and 11% slower at 4K, so not bad given it currently costs around 17% less. Now, with very high quality ray tracing disabled, the 9070 XT does quite well in Black Myth Wukong, trailing the 5070 Ti by a mere 6% margin at 1440p and then 10% at 4K, so not bad overall. The 9070 XT performs quite well in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and it's possible Radeon performance in general has improved since I first benchmarked this title. In any case, the 9070 XT was 13% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and then 8% slower at 4K. Now, the Rift Breaker has never been a great title for AMD Radeon GPUs, and that remains true for this latest matchup, which sees the 9070 XT coming in 20% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and then 24% slower at 4K. Using the ultra high preset in F124 does enable ray tracing, and this has traditionally really hurt the performance of Radeon GPUs, but with RDNA 4 that is no longer the case, and in fact the 9070 XT was able to match the 5070 Ti exactly at both of the tested resolutions. For testing War Thunder, I am using the DirectX 12 mode, which helps out the Radeon GPUs, but even so the 9070 XT was still 18% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p and 13% slower at 4K. Interestingly, the Radeon RX 9070 XT was faster at 1440p, beating the 5070 Ti by a slim 6% margin, though performance at 4K ended up near enough to call identical. We also see a similar thing in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, where the 9070 XT was 10% faster at 1440p, but at 4K the results are much the same. The Radeon GPU performed exceptionally well in Horizon Forbidden West, beating the 5070 Ti at both of the tested resolutions. At 1440p, we're looking at a 10% uplift and then an 11% improvement at 4K. Next up we have Warhammer 3, and this is a very positive title for AMD, as here the 9070 XT leads the 5070 Ti by an 11% margin at 1440p, and then 12% at 4K. So impressive margins given the Radeon GPU is much cheaper. Disabling path tracing in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle dramatically improves performance, and although the game still uses ray tracing, the 9070 XT was 15% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, with 107 FPS on average, which I think is pretty good for native performance. It was then 21% slower at 4K, so not great, but also not terrible performance given we're looking at 67 FPS on average at native 1440p. Unfortunately, Nvidia still hasn't addressed Blackwell's weak performance in Space Marine 2, though they have noted there's an issue in this title, at least when I've talked to them directly. As it stands right now, in the more demanding scenes, GPUs like the 5070 Ti struggle more than what they should, handing the 9070 XT a 17% win at 1440p and then a rather massive 36% win at 4K. Now, I spent quite a bit of time trying to diagnose the Radeon performance issues in Gears 5. Now look, granted the game, it ran, and performance overall was decent, certainly highly playable, but the 9070 XT was considerably slower than the 5070 Ti, 32% slower at 1440p and 33% slower at 4K. I have no idea why this is, but it's a bad loss for AMD. Thankfully, performance in the popular Rainbow Six Siege shooter was very good. Here the 9070 XT was just 7% slower than the 5070 Ti at 1440p, with both GPUs pushing well into 300 FPS. Then at 4K the Radeon GPU was just 6% slower, and both pushed near 200 FPS at this extreme resolution, so overall great performance. As always, Call of Duty is a Radeon special, and Black Ops 6 along with the 9070 XT is no exception, beating the 5070 Ti by a 22% margin at 1440p and then 19% at 4K, so a very solid win here for AMD. The 9070 XT trailed the 5070 Ti by a 9% margin in Stalker 2 at 1440p and then just 5% at 4K. So pretty competitive results here overall, and I think that's enough individual game data, so let's see how these GPUs stack up across all of the 55 games we benchmarked. Now, in our day one review featuring 18 games, I found that the 9070 XT was 6% slower than the 5070 Ti. And the good news is that that data is representative of a massive sample of games, as this 55 game benchmark saw the 9070 XT come in 5% slower than the 5070 Ti. The only real outlier in favour of the Radeon GPU was Rocket League, where the 9070 XT was somehow 41% faster, and then we see a handful of games where it was considerably slower, games such as ACC, Hunt Showdown, Gears 5 and GTA 5 Enhanced. What all this means is for 65% of the games tested, so 36 out of 55, the margin was 10% or less in either direction, which explains the 5% margin overall. So let's see how they compare at 4K. Now previously, using our review data, we found that the 9070 XT was just 1% slower than the 5070 Ti at 4K, but across 55 games, that margin increases slightly to 5% slower. So a 4% variance here, which is quite small, and the reason for this is the addition of titles such as Hunt Showdown, ACC, Gears 5, Gotham Knights, Homeworld 3, GTA 5 Enhanced, and the Rift Breaker. They all really hurt the performance of the 9070 XT, or at least the 9070 XT just didn't perform very well in these titles. Still, a 5% loss overall isn't exactly terrible, given the Radeon GPU costs at least 17% less. I suspect there will be some driver improvements for a few of these titles, which should help tighten that gap up a tiny bit. So there you have it. As it stands across a wide range of games, the 9070 XT is around 5%